welcome. A couple of months ago, I went to New York and the Madame Tussauds. And they had a VR experience where you actually can become a Ghostbuster. So naturally, I had to try it. So we get teamed up. We are 4 people in our team, and we even get geared up. So we get a helmet with a VR headset in it, and we get the guns, and we even get the proton pack. Kind of cool, if you're a fan. So we are sent into a New York apartment complex, and it's full of ghosts. We can open real doors, like physical doors, in the virtual reality, because they are tracking us, so they can actually overlay the real world with the virtual world. We even get to go on an elevator ride, and it really feels like a real elevator ride because there's some vibration in the floor, and the sound is so amazing. So I was sure we were in an elevator. We get to shoot ghosts, and at one time, I naturally missed a ghost, and it flies through me. And my whole body starts to vibrate, because in the vest we have, there's also a vibration thingy going on. So we go up the elevator to a really high floor. I don't know, it might be the top floor. And stuff happens, and there's an explosion. And it blows off the whole front of the building, leaving us on the ledge of a New York apartment really high up. And you can feel the wind blowing at you. And they told us we need to go from this house to another house on a small little fire escape ledge thingy. It's basically just a plank on the floor. And I am just a tiny bit afraid of heights. So I was like, no, I'm not going there, because I can see down on New York streets from really high up. So I cheated. I actually lifted my visors to be able to go over and finish the game. That's how good it was. But it also had some glitches, because the tracking wasn't spot on. Some of the avatars, they were kind of moving funny at times. And at one time, I looked over at my virtual colleague, which was a real person, but I saw a virtual avatar. And she had her gun. In the real world, she held it like this, but in the virtual world, it went through her stomach. Doesn't look that comfortable. And when she walked in through a doorway, what I saw, what she was walking through, half of the door and half the wall. And she wasn't one of the ghosts. And don't get me wrong, this material they have, it's amazing. So if you get the chance to try it, you really should. But what I'm saying is that it could have been better with just a few tweaks. And we are living in such exciting times. We have new technology popping up left and right every day now, which means we have new ways of augmenting your apps. And that's super fun, but this also means new way of interacting with your apps. We have human interaction and new types of controllers and everything. So this means that UX is more important than ever, because a bad user experience in this world can actually make your users physically ill. I will go through the differences in augmented reality, mixed reality, and virtual reality, and I will scratch the surface on where we can go wrong, how to fix it, and give you a few pointers to keep in mind when you're doing these things. And although many things may vary between the different platforms, I still think that there are things we can learn from each and every platform. My name is Jessica Engstro. I'm a Microsoft Windows Developer MVP, and I run a startup together with my husband, who's in the audience. And we do Windows development. And lately, we are doing like 80–90% of HoloLens, so holographic development. And that's super fun for us. And it shows that this thing is actually real. It's going on now. I do most of the UX and UI stuff, and Jimmy does most of the development stuff. And we also do workshops and stuff like that. So there are a lot of types of realities. So what is reality? One would think that all these new realities are fairly new, right? Well, they're not. In the late 60s, Ivan Sutherland, he made what is today known as, or widely known as, the first virtual reality and augmented reality and head-mounted display system. In the 60s. That's like ages ago. But the most fun part is the name. The contraption was called the Sword of Damocles. Is that kind of fun? So augmented reality has come and gone a few times since then. And the Pokemon Go, when that came around, it kind of made it mainstream. How many of you guys have tried Pokemon Go? Yeah, almost all of you. I have a Windows phone, so I haven't. So augmented reality is when you overlay or augment the real world with digital stuff. And you do so through a screen, so you can have your iPad or your phone or whatever. You see the real world, but you can't interact with it. Another technique in this area is called Pepper's Ghost, and this is actually from the exhibition in New York. And this is kind of a fun coincidence, I think, because it's called Pepper's Ghost and it's showing a ghost. And my point is, with showing this, is that this technique actually first mentioned back in 1862. 1862. That's how long we have known about stuff like this. So that's kind of amazing that we are still using these techniques in our machines today. And of course, there are much more advanced augmented reality devices than that. We have the DAQRI, for instance. This is aimed towards the industrial world. So it has hard helmet, so it's basically a hard hat, and it has a ruggedized visor, so it can withstand the industry. And they also announced at CES just a few weeks ago that they will do a lightweight version of it with the smart glasses, which also has the ruggedized glass, so it actually can withstand the wear and tear. Now, virtual reality is when you immerse yourself into the digital world. So we replace the whole world with a digital one. And the first game stations, if you will, we saw back in the 90s as at arcades. And I love this picture because you can see how dangerous virtual reality was. Because he's in this circular contraption, but that's not enough. He's also strapped in. And what I really love about this picture is that she actually thinks that he can see what she's pointing at. There are a lot of competitors on this VR market, and it keeps growing. And this is just a few of them. Some of them have external tracking, so you have sensors put up in one way or another, like the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift. Yeah, those are the trackers. So, mixed reality. This is when you bring the virtual world into the real world. And you see the real world with your own eyes, so not through a screen anymore. And the digital objects can actually interact with the real world. This is a game called Young Conquer for the HoloLens, and as you can see, he's actually jumping on the sofa thingy chair and onto the table because he knows what's the table, what's the floor, the walls, everything like that. In this area, we have the HoloLens and the Meta 2, but there's also many coming on their way. And these can be either tethered or not. Now, Windows Holographic is the possibility to run Windows app in the HoloLens. And this is being made available to use in the virtual world. So that means that you can actually develop a UVP app for the Windows platform and release it in your favorite VR headset. And this also goes for the holographic apps on the HoloLens. And Microsoft also announced that they are collaborating with a lot of these new VR headset manufacturers to bring the inside-out tracking, the sort of tracking that the HoloLens has to keep track of the area it's in, to the VR world. So this means that we will have no more bumping into chairs and running into walls. So that will be really amazing when that comes. So now we know the difference. How do we start? Well, I would say you need to start to identify the experience. And here you need to think long and hard on what kind of experience you want to design. I tried the NASA Destination to Mars on the HoloLens a while back, and you go into a room, and it's a dark room. It has black walls and black ceiling and even black floors. There are some white scribbles all over the place, so the HoloLens knows where it is. And NASA have collected a lot of data from the Mars rover and the orbiter to actually let you go stand on a piece of Mars. So you can go and walk on Mars. And you can go around and you find a rock and you can see information about that rock. And even Buzz Aldrin is there virtually to explain stuff to you. So really cool, but a fully immersive experience. So I would say that this is actually more suited for virtual reality. And this is what I mean when I say that you should think about what experience you want to make. Because this doesn't take advantage of the mixed reality as a platform. It doesn't interact with the real world. It doesn't know where my chairs are. There's nothing on the walls, etc. So you need to think about, do you want to design a full world, or do you just want to overlay some information on the phone, for instance? Then you need to identify the tech. Because they're popping up so many new devices in a really fast pace. So it's super important to actually identify the type of tech you're going to run your game or app on. Because there isn't one VR experience or one augmented reality experience. So think about where you want to be, what tech is going to be used. Because in the 2D world, when we design for the 2D world, we can develop one app. We can design one app and run it on all the platforms with little or no harm. I wouldn't recommend it, but the worst thing that can happen is that I will have an iPhone button in my Windows phone. I won't die from it. I won't get sick from it. But you can get sick from it if you do that in the 3D world. So the solution you write and the hardware you run on will have an effect on the user's experience and can actually prevent cybersickness. So now that you know what tech you're going to use, next up is to identify the play area. And I call it play area, but I don't mean just for games. There are a few different types of areas, and the experience differs a bit. So we have the stationary or almost stationary, where you either sit by the desk or in the couch, or actually you can stand up as well. But the point is you're not moving around that much. And then we have the location-based room scale. And this is where you usually have a custom rig set up. And let's say a museum. And you can walk around in old-time castles and things like that and look around. And you might have a real chair in the real world, but you overlay that with a throne so you can sit there and wave like a royal. And then we have the more usual or common way, which is roomscale. And here the user can walk freely within the tracked area, like the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift. And the actual tracking area will also differ depending on what tech you are developing for. And the Rift, I think, has the HTC Vive has about 15 by 15 feet. And the Oculus has 3 different, depending on how many cameras you have. So even if you only want to release on the Oculus Rift, you also need to think about how many cameras does the user have. And when developing for a tethered device, you also need to think about the restriction, because you have to make sure that you're not yanking the cord out, or like I'm sure I have done, yank the actual computer down to the floor and break it. And this also goes to augmented the world or the mixed reality world. As soon as you're tethered, you need to think about that. So don't make them run like 2 meters forward if they don't have the cord for it. Now, if you're developing for the HoloLens or the DAQRI, you don't have any cords, so the actual play area doesn't matter that much anymore. And the HoloLens uses something called world scale. And it has sensors in the headset that's constantly scanning the room. Where's the roof? Where's the floor? Where's the walls? Where's the chair? Where's the actual stain on the floor? And things like that, to keep track of where you are and where the holograms are being placed. So, now that we have defined the actual play area, how does the user move in this defined area? Well, we have Gamepad, which is the classical way of moving in games, right? And it works on most of the platforms. And then we have teleportation. And this is a common way to move longer distances in your games. Like the HTC Vive has a game called The Lab, where you use your controller to project a beam of sorts on the floor, and you can move around and see, okay, I want to go there. And then you click, and you teleport there. And then we have another technique which Batman Arkham VR uses on PlayStation VR, where you have symbols like this. You have a bat and a controller on different places that will take you to predefined areas. So you cannot choose freely, but you go to the predefined areas. Now, both of these are fairly easy to use, but the one that the lab uses, although I like the precision of it, it takes some learning, so make sure the user actually knows how to use it. Then we have physical movement, and this is where the user walks, usually, and they can walk around freely. So sometimes it can be good to actually shorten the distance within the game. It looks further than it is, so the user can walk a couple of meters, and all of a sudden they work 10 meters in the game. So they don't have to walk a couple of miles just to get to the next village. So decide if you want to use one of these or a couple of them. So now we know how to move. How do we interact with the world? With all these new mediums, we have new ways of interacting. We have human interaction, and we have new types of controllers. Sure, they might not be super new, but if you compare it to 30 years of 2D interaction, they're kind of new. So, the most familiar one we already talked about, that's controllers and the gamepad, for instance. And then we have the specialty controller. So this one is, the HoloLens has a clicker, and the HTC Vive have their own special controller, and so does the Oculus Rift. And this one might look a little funny, but it's actually super slick. It can actually track your your hand really good, because if you will see your virtual hand in the game, and if they can detect whether you have your thumb on the trackpad or not, and your hand will actually move, or if you have your finger on the trigger or not. Super slick. Some of these devices also are Bluetooth enabled, which means you can use a regular mouse or keyboard. Now, this might not be the best experience if you want them to use a keyboard if you're in the virtual world, because you want to see what you're writing. So you can't take it for granted either. But if we go back to the HoloLens, the first time Jimmy tried the HoloLens, he came back almost out of breath. He was so excited. I kid you not. And he was like, "Mouse! The mouse popped out!" I was like, "Calm down. What did you get to try?" Because I wasn't so fortunate, so I didn't try it back then. So he told me about an architectural demo he had tried. So he stood by a computer, and there was this 3D program like SketchUp or something, and you had a building. And then beside him, he had a hologram, and he was fitted with a HoloLens. So he used the mouse to manipulate the building's height, and the hologram corresponded to that. Pretty cool. But then the instructor told him to take the mouse cursor and put it on the very edge of the computer and keep going. So he did, and the mouse popped out. So he could now see the mouse cursor in the real world and manipulate the actual hologram directly using the mouse. So this is apparently the best thing since sliced bread, so just so you know. And this is actually, you can see the mouse cursor here. So my point is that some of you users won't use mouse and keyboard, but some of them will. So if you make the experience to be compatible with both, you will have users like Jimmy raving about your solutions for years. So that's good. For the devices that has hand tracking, like the HoloLens and Intel, and even VR headsets, there you will use gestures. And the HoloLens has a couple of predefined headsets. They have a couple of predefined gestures, like the air tap. And what happens when you air tap is a click event. And what happens then is completely up to you and contextual. Some games and apps have implemented their own version of gestures, like Superman Flight, for instance. Now, I do approve of the superhero part of this, even though it is a DC character, but think about how the user will actually use that. Do they want to stand like this and fly for 2 hours in a row? Or is that a bit strenuous? So that's just a word of caution when it comes to implementing your own gestures. I've been demoing the HoloLens for quite a while now, and probably for around 2,000 people, and we've been using the predefined gestures, like the air tap. Seems very easy, right? I've seen it all. I've seen the angry duck. I've seen the Pac-Man. I've seen move every single finger but the one you're supposed to. I've seen grabbing in the air. I've seen swiping like in the movies. So my point is, what's obvious for you might not be that obvious for everybody. So think about that before you implement your own stuff, unless it's Spider-Man's web-slinging gestures. Then I'm on for it. So, gaze. This is basically where you look. Unless you have an eye-tracking device, it is actually where your head is pointing. So you have a line in between your eyes like this. So you're basically pointing with your forehead. But it's a good idea not to execute on every single move when it comes to gaze. Because if you look around the room like this, and you will have menus popping up like crazy, And it gets even worse if you actually have sound attached to them. That will be kind of tiresome. And also in the beginning, the users need to get acquainted with all these new interaction patterns. So my point is here that from a UX point of view, it's better to actually make sure that the user actually wants to interact with that specific item. So an example could be that when they look at a specific item, you pop up the choices on the side or under it or something like that. So when they actually click on that one, you know that they really want to interact with that and they're not just dragging their eyes. Voice is another way of interacting, and that's really good because most of the users already know how to talk, so that you don't have to teach them anything. So use that whenever it's possible and suitable. Because it's usually much more easy to say, take a picture, than actually navigate through the menus. But it's also very important to actually think about language design. But that's a whole other presentation, so I won't go into that. And this is why services like Alexa and Cortana and Siri is so popular. And we get voice integrated to so many devices today. The HoloLens, for instance, has an array of 4 microphones, and that's because they want to sort out whatever you're saying from what your friends are saying and the surroundings. And I've tried that in so many environments, and it's working really great. So take advantage of that. With all these new cool ways of interacting with AR, VR, and MR, it might be tempting to design something that looks like it comes from makes a Minority Report in Star Trek. But this might get tiresome if you're working for like 8 hours. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use cool stuff like that, like using the Force or the Superman, but I'm saying use it sparsely and think about how long they are actually going to use it. So now we know how the user interacts with the world, but how does the world interact with the user? Being that the user is in such an immersive world, it will be so much harder for you to communicate with the users because they are going around and looking at all the amazing stuff, right? So we have to work a little harder to catch their attention sometimes. And we don't have set frames like we used to if we're developing for the web or the phone or something like that. So we don't snap the information, the menus to the left and the content in the middle and stuff like that, because our canvas is all of a sudden 360 degrees. We don't even know which way they're going to face, do we? Well, we could just anchor this stuff to the user's camera so it's always in sight, even when they turn around. But putting stuff in people's faces like that is not that pleasant, especially when it comes to like pointy stuff in games. And also, it can actually obstruct the rest of the world. If you have like massive amount of information going on, all of a sudden I don't see you anymore. And it can make the user cybersick. So we don't want to put all the information on the screen constantly, because it will get cluttered very easy. So unless you are designing for Iron Man, or the information doesn't have to be shown all the time, use contextual menus and actions. The Destination Mars demo I told you about does this beautifully, because if I look at something over here, a rock or something, there will be a menu, and if I interact with that menu, the context change. So I will have another set of choices, but I'm still over here. Now, I've seen examples of really beautiful menu items or menus. So I go over here and I look at something and I want to interact with it, and they have this really sexy animation. Things just swooshes out like this. Super nice. But if I want to use or I want to interact with that item, all of a sudden, I have no context to the object I'm interacting with. So you really have to think about the relationship between the contextual items and the nested menus. Also, if you have information that you want to put a label or information about an object in the 3D world, put it on the same z-axis as the object you want to label. Because you might want to, if you're like in, let's say, Google Maps, and you're walking around, and we have the hotel aloft here, and behind it you see part of the Excel, and you want to put NDC London over it. You might want to put it closer, because otherwise you can't read it, but it would make much more sense if you actually touch it, even if the aloft is hindering you to read all the time. So, same z-axis. So, how on earth are we getting the attention of the user? Well, there are a few tricks we can use. We can use visual cues. It could be glowing or pulsating on the item we want to draw attention to, but make sure you don't just do it once, because if the user is turned around, they would have missed it. So you don't want things going blink all the time, right? But you could do, in the beginning, it glows like that, and then it just has a tiny little glow around it, or something similar. With VR, MR, and AR, we also need to think more spatially, like the ZX thing, Z-axis, I should say. Because we have this completely different canvas. And one thing will be more important than ever, and that is audio. So if you have multiple objects that can make a sound, make sure you attach the audio controller on the actual items. Because the spatial audio will help the user to find their way if they're not seeing the object in their field of view. And many of these devices uses gaze, like we talked about before. And this can also give us, audio can also give us help when it comes to making more physical, making the objects more physical, in a sense. And we do that with haptic audio. Yeah, I know, you can't really touch audio. But if you give the objects and surfaces a lifelike sound, they will almost become tactile to the user. Is the character running on snow? Are they running on grass? Is this hollow or not? Is it made of metal or wood? All these things can actually also make it clearer to the user what they can act on. Can they lift this or not? And things like that. And designing in a 2D world, we have learned lately that we should be genuinely digital. We shouldn't imitate the real world. But in the 3D world, that's exactly what we need to do. So this video is an example of why haptic audio is a great idea. You get the idea. So the same thing goes for audio cues as to visual cues. We need to be sure that the user actually knows that something is going to happen, or if they can trigger something. So let's say you're playing a game and you're in the middle of an antique shop, and you're about to send in a bad guy from behind. So how do you let the user know that something is going to happen over here? Well, you could let a mouse run over the counter, and you can hear his tiny little paws on the countertop, and he's squeaking and all that stuff. But a good practice is to use steps of 3. So first you have the mouse run over the counter to just acknowledge that something is happening. And then you do something else, like you have the mice, couple of mice running over. And then the user will know that something is going to happen any second now. And if they still don't get it, you could have a whole horde of mice running from the actual bad guy. You won't miss that. So audio is really important for the experience. And it can actually also help with the field of view. If we take HoloLens as an example again, you have about a printer size field of view on arm length distance. And how do we counteract that? Well, there's a game called Fragments for the HoloLens, and this is one of my favorite games on the HoloLens. So we're in a HoloCall, and I'm talking to my peers and superiors, and I see them in the field of view. But all of a sudden, I hear a sound over here, and I turn around, and there's another lady. So what my brain is telling me is that I'm not only seeing this one, the world is actually 360 now. So that can help. Now, VR is sometimes, as a joke, called Vommit Reality. How many of you have actually felt sick or had a headache from VR? Yeah, a little bit more than half of you. So this makes UX so much more important, because if you're a little bit off, people may get sick. The fact is that we haven't cracked the nut that is motion sickness, or cyber sickness, I should say. We have some theories and we have some solutions, but this is still a fairly new medium, and we are writing the UX guidelines today. We are doing research about this stuff today, so it will get better. We have three prominent theories to cyber sickness, and one of them is poison theory, which is based on the theory that the hallucinations we see in virtual reality corresponds to poison, and our body goes into survival mode and wants to expel whatever poison you have left in your stomach. We have the postural instability theory, which is based on that the main goal of the human body is to maintain postural stability in all environments. So prolonged postural instability we'll call cyber sickness, which, well, all the quick changes in the environment in VR is said to give postural instability and therefore also cyber sickness. The third theory is sensory conflict theory. And this is a theory based on the conflict between two key sensory systems, the visual and the vestibular. I went a little bit too far. Here we go. So these sensory systems provide information about the person's orientation and perceived motion and the mismatch in these two. So the vestibular says to you that you're stationary, but the visual senses tells you that you're moving, hence the mismatch and possible cyber sickness. So we have to work around this as much as we can. What we do know about cyber sickness is that there are a lot of individual factors to cyber sickness. So, for instance, children between the age of 2 and 12 are more susceptible to cyber sickness. And when they grow older, that will actually rapidly decrease. Women have a wider field of view, which makes us more susceptible to flicker and therefore also cyber sickness. And there's been research that says that female hormones can actually also affect the susceptibility. Underlying illnesses or hangovers, flu, stuff like that will also increase the susceptibility. And even things like posture or whether you are standing or sitting can have an effect. Stuff like latency and flicker also induces cyber sickness. So this is why it's so important that you actually test your solution on the machines that is going to run it, and not your monster machine you're actually doing the development on. How is the user moving around? Are they riding a train or a car? Or are they sitting in their couch and not moving a muscle? Now, sure, you could try to be safe and let the player always be stationary and everything comes to them, but that won't solve all the problems. And also, what's the fun in that? And there isn't one magical solution that will work for everybody. What works for me might not work for you, and vice versa. So if you have the time and the budget for it, you could enable more than one way to navigate. And this will actually make your app more compatible with even more devices. So that's a win-win situation. Then we have avatars and bodies. Because free roaming games are fantastic, but some people will get sick from it. And you can try to help them by giving them a virtual body. That will help a lot if it's done right. But if you have a body that doesn't correspond with the user's own body, that can make things even worse. If it's badly rendered, so you have your feet under the actual floor, that's not good. Or if you're rendering me and the virtual table goes through my virtual body, not so pleasant. And same thing goes for bad tracking when your body is all of a sudden moving like crazy. And especially things like if you're trying to get the user to look one way and you're actually turning the camera for them, big no-no. Because if the user is not in control of where they're looking, they will get sick. Also, some people prefer third-person view of the game or solution. So that can also help a bit, but it won't help at all of them. If you put your user on a vehicle or something that moves, especially on a curve or you have unpredicted turns and stuff like that, they also can get sick. A friend of mine, his name is Max. He is a professional game developer, and he got together with a few friends and made a game called #Archery. And at one point in the game, you are on top of a moving truck. And what they noticed is when the truck turned, the horizon turned as well, which it would in the real world, right? But people got so sick from it. So what they did do was lock the rotation of the tracking space. So it's basically like standing in the middle of an articulated bus or an accordion bus, if you will. And that helped a lot. And another thing when it comes to driving or moving, if the user is not driving the car, but they are a passenger, and actually even if they are driving it, you can show the road ahead of them, because that will give your brain a heads up that a turn is coming. So that can actually help with cyber sickness. And actually that works in real life as well. If you see the road, you will tend to get less motion sick. But you can also use transportation like transporters or blink to move the user, unless the journey is actually part of the story. And since there are so many individual factors that can affect your experience, and we are taking away so much of the interface from the user's face, so to say, we need to put a little bit more time and effort to user research and testing. And testing should never, ever be skipped when it comes to augmented reality and mixed reality, and especially not when it comes to virtual reality. Testing should preferably be done really early and often. And it's also best to test it out on the audience you are trying to reach. So it's not you that's doing the testing or your friend who does VR all the time. It's actually better to have your grandmother try it out. She would be the perfect subject, I think. And keep testing often. There are a couple of few tips that you can use to make things a little bit more comfortable for the user. Some things will be really new to the users because they haven't used things like this before. So ease in the user to the experience. Don't just put them smack in an immersive world where they don't know what is going on. It's better to use solutions like Oculus Rift have this solution. They have a virtual lobby of sorts, and then you have to click on something to actually load the game. Tutorials and how-tos are also a really great way to let the user know how they can interact, and it's often a necessity. But don't just show them the tutorial once. Make sure they can actually go back and start it again, or if their friend is trying it out, and so on. If you are moving on an elevator and you can see out, or if you're on a balloon ride or something like that, it's a good idea to actually have something like a still focal point that you can focus on while in motion, because that will also take away some of the motion sickness. It's also a very good idea to let the user know when they are coming too close to the furniture or the wall. Because in augmented reality and mixed reality, we get this for free, but in virtual reality, we don't. So it's up to us to actually help the user know where they are. And this can also help them feel more immersed in the world if they don't have to think about where's the wall, where's the floor. Well, the floor, they know where that is. So we talked about the field of view in mixed reality. So counteract that by making the items smaller so they actually fit in the field of view. Or place the items further in the environment. So that's a trick. And also your brain is fantastic because, again, if we take the HoloLens as an example, I don't even notice that I'm restricted to the field of view anymore because I will automatically back away a little bit if the hologram doesn't fit in the field of view. And when you use it for a while, you start to move more naturally because in the beginning, you're more like a robot like this. So that will also help. And the spatial audio. Smoothing should also be your best friend, especially when it comes to things like gaze and gaze cursors, because if we didn't have smoothing in our headset, well, our head-mounted displays, things would get really jittery. So if you're using the raw data to do your own cursors or gaze, it can really be jittery, so be careful of that and use smoothing. And when you are ready to take the user out of virtual reality, fade to black. Don't just pull the cord, so to speak, because that will be so much pleasant to be faded out to the real world. So, where are all these techniques headed? We have so many cool devices already today, and we have so many cool sensors available to us that we could incorporate to the next generation. We can measure whether your palms are sweaty or not, and how sweaty they are. We can measure your pulse. We can measure the differences in your voice, and things like that. Even vibration vests and temperature change, all the IoT spaces, and also eye tracking. This means that the game characters actually can look you in the eye, which kind of gives me the creeps. So, are you trying to cheat on, let's say, the personal training experience you're using? Are you doing enough sit-ups? They will know. Are you putting the experience too high up, so I actually have to cheat? Is the horror game scary enough, or should we crank it up a bit? So to sum things up, identify the experience, the tech, and the play area. And think about interaction both from you to the world and the world to you. Try to make it as comfortable as possible for the user so they don't get sick. And if there is one thing, if you only take one thing away from this presentation, it's testing. Because you can't tick all the boxes in making the perfect game. But if you test it enough, you can come pretty damn close. Thank you.